In this lecture, we'll be looking at the concept of a system and how we understand it. We will then begin to apply this scientific concept to our planet. The first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is a system? Well, simply put, a system is any ordered, interrelated set of things, their attributes, and any forms of linkages that connect them. A system, for our purposes, is going to be focused on the concept of flow and all of the processes involved in that. In this case, it will be looking at flow as it relates to energy and matter and their interaction. It is important to remember that systems are distinct. We can separate them out and understand them individually. We can also take a look at how natural systems interact with one another. Another important concept that we need to keep in mind is that the elements within a system are arranged. They are often interwoven with one another and interdependent. Within the Earth's many natural systems, both matter and energy are stored and retrieved. By matter, we are referring to mass that assumes a physical shape and occupies physical space. Energy is the perceived capacity to affect the condition of matter, its movement through space, and/or its transformation physically. If, for example, we take a look at the leaf of a plant, we see a process and we see an interaction between matter and energy. So the plant leaf and the related process of photosynthesis have systematic qualities. Let's take a closer look. Photosynthesis, again, is a process. It's a mechanism of reproduction or change within a system by which an organism, in this case a plant, uses sunlight to synthesize energy from carbon dioxide and water. Photosynthesis in plants generally involves the performance of a green pigment, in this case chlorophyll, and it results in the creation or the generation of a particular element known as oxygen. Oxygen is a byproduct of this systematic process. Now, to look at it through a systematic lens, we have to attach an additional quality with regard to the photosynthetic system. Here we recognize that light, carbon dioxide or CO2, nutrients, and water are all qualities of a system, all parts and pieces of a system that are interacting with one another. Our source of energy here is, or at least one source of energy here, is going to be visible light. It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's a wavelength. It is also composed of photons, these massless particles, and it ultimately drives the system. Light can be considered also part of our understanding of what matter is involved in the process, but we'll leave that to the side for just a moment. Another area where we see energy being expressed in this systematic example is in terms of chemical compounds that are being stored as part of the process of photosynthesis. Here we have oxygen and we have things like carbohydrates that are being stored by the plant. They are, in a sense, a fuel for that plant to grow. So the leaf and what's occurring in terms of this process of photosynthesis gives us a pretty good example of what a system is. We have aspects of matter, a lot of this is chemical in nature, and we have energy. A lot of this is associated with the Sun-Earth relationship, and of course the chemical compounds that we find in the lower atmosphere. We have an interaction between matter and energy in its many different forms, and we have, in a sense, a process that allows a plant to grow and develop over time. So the leaf, in a sense, represents an open system. The elements of the system function in an interrelated manner, yet they are not necessarily self-contained. Energy and matter flow into and out of the system in a very processual way. So too, the Earth itself can be considered to be an open system. Here we see solar energy of the kind described in relation to our example of the leaf freely entering the system, as well as heat. Heat energy also enters the Earth's system. And we realize too that heat is being lost back out into space. So the elements of our earthly system function in an interrelated manner, but are again not self-contained. Another way of looking at the Earth system is that we can recognize it to be a dynamic system, in that it is in a constant state of motion or flux. There is a tremendous influx of radiant energy from the thermonuclear reactions that occur within the sun. And we know that these thermonuclear reactions and the energies associated with them, things that we receive here within the solar system, are not constant, meaning that we will see increases and decreases as we relate to where the sun is in our earthly orbit, and as the sun itself continues to change and develop in a very dynamic manner. This energy from the sun penetrates the outermost edge of the Earth's atmosphere and cascades through the terrestrial systems that are part of the Earth. As the radiant energy from the sun is moving through the terrestrial systems of the planet, it is being transformed. This radiant energy will become things like kinetic energy at particular points in the process, or energy of motion, as well as chemical energy. Again, we see the chemical energy of the sun being expressed in the process of photosynthesis. So the Earth, like our leaf example, is an open system. Now let's take a moment and look back at our leaf and this process of photosynthesis and relate it to a little bit of what we have looked at with regard to the Earth as an open system. So as the Earth releases heat energy, the leaf, in our example, releases matter through the process of respiration. Respiration reverses the flows that occur in the system during the day when we have the sun out. It produces outputs also as things like carbon dioxide and water, while using things like oxygen and consuming or oxidizing stored sugars to produce energy for the cells and what they need to operate. So both the planet and our leaf are open systems. They're also systems that are dynamic. Now let's take a look at a closed system. A closed system is a system that is isolated from the surrounding environment. In fact, a closed system is very uncommon when we're talking about our planet and the many systems and processes that are associated with it. With regard to physical matter and resources such as air, water, and material, the Earth can also sometimes be considered a closed system. Its internal resources are recognized to be finite. However, they are added to in very minuscule ways. So when we're talking about things like soil, rock material associated with the planet itself, this would be something that is not actively being added to. However, we do know that things like meteors, cosmic dust, and meteoric dust are entering our atmosphere. We also know that the heat and the light gases associated with our planet, in this case the light gases being associated with our atmosphere, do escape, but they escape on a very slow rate, or at a very slow rate rather. So as I said before, a closed system is hard to find. The Earth itself could be packaged in either one, though. You could look at it as an open system, which my opinion is that it should be considered always to be an open system. But then you could argue against that, and you could consider it to be closed or have qualities of a closed system. Often closed systems in science are things that are controlled. They're things that we would consider to be experimental projects or would be associated with experimental research. Another consideration we have to make when we're looking at natural systems or when we're utilizing the systems concept as we study our planet and its many landscapes and land features is the idea of systematic feedback. So as a system operates, it processes or it generates outputs that are in turn influencing other aspects of that system, more often than not, these outputs help the system to continue to operate. In a number of scientific fields, if not all scientific fields, this concept of feedback, or these outputs, are considered or are packaged as a kind of information. This information is constantly produced via pathways within a systematic model. It is then returning to that system or moving within that system via the same pathways. And we call this interaction or this process a kind of feedback loop. The recognition of these qualities becomes important, especially when we are addressing things like the interaction between humanity and nature, in this case human ecology, and its relationship with the larger earthly system. Or if we are to look at this concept of feedback, systematic feedback, as it relates to our example of the plant, the photosynthetic system will react to increases or decreases in day length and sunlight availability. Carbon dioxide and water will produce feedback that elicits or causes specific responses in the larger plant body. For example, if we see a decrease in the input of water within a plant's system, the many processes, including photosynthesis, will begin to, and again, the processes of that plant will begin to slow. If we see an increase in daylight exposure, or if we start to allow a plant body to have greater access to nutrients, which would include water, we may start to see an increase in the processes associated with growth. So in this case, matter and energy are treated as information, inter and intra-systematic communications that discourage or encourage a continued systematic process, such as photosynthesis or growth, or the chemical storage of energy within the plant's body. If storage and growth are observed to decline, the feedback would be negative. If they increase, the feedback would be positive. So this conversation of negative and positive forms of feedback within a dynamic, open system becomes important to the work of physical geographers as we begin to understand how a landscape is developing or changing over time. Even how a landscape initially formed can be understood in this systematic way. Another way of looking at it would be to look at how streams or the surface flow of water on the planet behaves. We may look at river basins, or we may take a look at the meandering of a particular river system. And when we talk about the Mississippi River, we'll see some of this as well. We'll see this as a very dynamic system with many different positive and negative kinds of feedback loops that generally shape this unique natural system over time. But one of the important qualities that is systematic in nature and is something that we'll have to look at more closely is the concept of equilibrium. Generally, when you look at a landscape, when you take a look at a glacial body, we'll be studying glaciers in this course, we realize that those particular expressions of earthly matter have a general tendency to be balanced. That matter in our planetary system has a desire to remain in a more stable state of equilibrium. However, this concept of a stable state of equilibrium is quite unique. Most systems maintain their general structure and character over time. At least they want to do this by their nature. This is what makes them predictable. And again, that's an important part of the scientific process that we want to be able to measure or even understand. An energy and matter system that remains balanced over time is said to be in a steady state of equilibrium. When the rates of inputs and outputs within a system are equal, or near to equal, and the amounts of energy and matter in storage within the system are relatively constant. Again, we are in a state of steady state equilibrium. But I will tell you that this is very, very unique. It's something that we do not see readily occurring within nature. What we do see is systems that are in a state of flux, pretty dynamic flux. When a steady state system begins to fluctuate over time, we see a condition of it becoming or being a kind of dynamic equilibrium. A state of a system being in dynamic equilibrium means that we see changing trends of either increases or decreases in terms of systematic operations, in this case things like inputs and outputs. An example of a system that is in a state of dynamic equilibrium would be the Earth's climate, and we will spend time looking at climate maps and understanding the many factors that go into how we organize climate and climate change. With the Earth's climate, we see shifts occurring around a set pattern of gradual change. We also see long-term climatic changes, such as an increase in global temperatures, and we use these to understand how climates and climate types may be in a state of change. Physical geographers also collect data on not only atmospheric temperature change, but also the temperature changes that we see in marine environments and, of course, in freshwater environments as well. Change in this case associated with global climates is not necessarily abrupt. It is very long term, it is gradual. Systems by their nature attempt to resist any sort of catastrophic event or any sort of major disruption in their processes. However, this does occur. We see this with things like landslides. When a system has an abrupt change, or when an abrupt change occurs, the system is recategorized in terms of its equilibrium. It becomes part of a metastable equilibrium. And as this abrupt change occurs, one of the things that we see is that the system is trying to rebalance itself. It's trying to reach some sort of natural threshold which exists, a natural and balanced relationship between energy and matter within that system. In the late 1980s, for example, landslides along the Pacific coast of the United States were very, very common. We saw this especially in and around the San Francisco area. These major shifts within coastal systems, and again, the landslide being a observable output of that major abrupt metastable change. Again, they had reached or were attempting to reach some sort of threshold. They surpassed a threshold with regard to things like soil moisture, and as a result, these landslides occurred, and there was a pretty significant amount of loss of life and many possessions as well. So in this case, hundreds of meters of bluff area began to suddenly collapse. This tragic event, and we've seen this occur in years following the late 1980s, was in a sense abrupt and punctuated change within the coastal system. The environments surrounding San Francisco, and especially to its south with regard to the coastal landscape, were attempting to create a new kind of equilibrium systematically, and it was achieved rather among elements of slope and the physical material, and then of course energy and the presence of water in soil. We had all of these variables interacting with one another, and we had a threshold met, and then we had a threshold overcome, and then we had a landscape that attempted to kind of rebalance itself after these thresholds had been overcome. So the interaction in this case between slope, physical material, soil, and energy, we saw rapidly increasing mass through water being expressed in these environments. We had then this threshold overcome by the landmass, and then we had a return to a form of balance or a form of equilibrium. We will be applying this systems concept to the Earth's abiotic systems. Now, when you see the term abiotic, please don't become confused. There are biotic qualities of many of these geological spheres that we'll be looking at, but in terms of their building blocks, what they're composed of, and the large scale variables that are at work inside of these systems, they are generally abiotic in nature. In the coming lectures, we will be taking a look at these more closely. We'll be looking at the atmosphere, for example, this thin gaseous veil that surrounds the Earth and ensures life on the planet. And we'll take a look at it from a few different perspectives to understand how it functions and its purpose. We will take a systematic look at the hydrosphere, again inclusive of the Earth's waters, those that are existing within the atmosphere, on the surface of the planet, and then within the crust or near to the surface of the planet as well. We will take a look at the Earth's crust in terms of the lithosphere, which will also include a portion of the upper mantle directly below the crust. Our study of the lithosphere will, of course, include not only our interest in geology, and we'll look at many different geological qualities of landscapes across the planet, but it will also include the edaphosphere, which would be a portion of the lithosphere which contains all of the soils of this part of our planet. And then the last piece of the puzzle, which we will take a look at both in terms of how it exists systematically and scientifically, but then also its distribution across the planet and its relation to patterns of weather and climate, is the biosphere, which is the systematic web linking all living organisms with one another and their physical environment. Sometimes called the ecosphere, the biosphere exists in the overlap between the abiotic qualities of the previous geological spheres that I mentioned, but then also how those abiotic spheres overlap with life on the planet. We will see how this biosphere is by no means static. We will recognize how it constantly changes, how it begins and constantly begins to reorganize itself at times in reaction to changes in some of these other parts of our planetary system.